Moving along now on to Note 10, which covers mergers and takeovers. First, we're going to talk about mergers and consolidations. Now, in everyday English and even in business English that they use on television, on the business networks and in business periodicals, mergers and consolidations have kind of been blended together in the public mind as if they were the same thing. Basically, any combining of two or more companies into one is considered a merger or consolidation, and the words are almost used as if they are exactly the same. However, in the law, they have distinct meanings. Right? A merger is when two or more companies combined, at the end of which one of those companies still exists and the other company no longer exists as a separate entity. It has basically been absorbed into the second company, but the second company continues and goes on. A consolidation is when two companies are brought together and both cease to exist as a separate entity, and a new corporation is created from the assets and the shareholders and the business activities of the old two corporations that no longer exist. In both situations, or both of these situations, the new corporation receives all the rights and properties of the older corporations, but it also retains all of the liability. So if there is any tort or criminal liability or any contracts, outstanding loans, whatever ends up being the final existing corporation still has the duty to cover those and take care of those. In trying to do mergers and consolidations, one of the big issues is, what do we do with shareholders? How do we deal with shareholders who may not always want to be part of this? And certainly if it's a situation where one or more boards of directors and suites of officers are going to disappear, they may not want particularly to be involved in this. Several mechanisms exist to kind of make this work and to try and keep all the parties, if not happy, at least somewhat satisfied with what's going on. One can be a share exchange, that the shareholders of the old corporation or corporations are now given shares of stock for the new company by turning in their shares of the company or companies that are no longer going to exist. All right. So the shareholders of the prior corporation or corporations actually become shareholders of the new successor corporation. And if monetarily that appears to be in their benefit, many shareholders will happily go along with that. If a corporation owns all the shares of stock of another corporation, then the owning corporation is called the parent company, and the corporation that is owned is called the subsidiary. So a subsidiary is basically a company that is wholly owned by another corporation. In these types of situations, the parent company can move to dissolve or to absorb or to merge with the other company because they are the sole shareholder. They basically control what's going to happen, and they can vote to do what they wish. Mergers, consolidations, share exchanges must all be approved by boards of directors of both companies and by the shareholders of both companies. The boards must carefully develop a plan full of whatever important information, relevant information there is to present to the shareholders, so the shareholders can make an informed vote on what's going to happen. If the board that wants this to happen doesn't do that, they can be sued later by disgruntled shareholders saying that they were not told all the ramifications or all the effects of voting in favor of the merger or the consolidation. A short-form merger is when the parent company decides to dissolve the subsidiary company. Appraisal rights. Under modern court decisions, minority shareholders who do not approve of the consolidation or merger can force the surviving company to have an appraisal done to determine what the market value of the shares are, and they can force the resulting company to buy out their shares if they feel they've been aggrieved as minority shareholders. So these things are done. They still happen routinely, but they are very difficult at this point in time. And there has to really be a financial benefit going to the shareholders to get them on board and to make it work. Now, very often, a company will just purchase the assets of another company. And this could include contract rights, this could include orders, it could include client rights, client base, client lists, client agreements. So in this situation, the company that's being bought out would basically cease to exist. Once all their assets are gone and the cash distributed to their shareholders, they would dissolve themselves. One of the biggest benefits to the new company is that in this situation, if they do a clean asset purchase, they are not liable for any of the prior debts or torts or activities of the company that is now being dissolved. They basically buy the assets and buy the contract rights, buy the patents, the trademarks, whatever, and then whoever had a claim or a grievance against a prior company, they're really left out in the air with nothing, or they can try and sue before the monies are dispersed from the buyout. Even so, the company who is buying the assets has to be careful, because there are times when, similar to piercing the corporate veil, courts have looked at these situations and say, no, this was a sham. You really were taking over and running the other corporation, so you should be responsible for its liabilities. So the exception to a clear or clean asset purchase are, number one, if the surviving company expressly assumes the liability, say, oh yeah, we'll take that over, sell us all this and we'll pay off that debt or we'll pay off that bill. If the transaction is more than an asset sale, so if board members and officers are going on to the new company, if shares of stock are being issued in the new company to former owners or officers of the old company, if it looks like somehow we're commingling the businesses, then the court will say it's not really an asset sale, it's a merger. If the purchasing company continues the selling company's business, keeps the same shareholders, directors, officers. So basically, if the purchasing company just sets up the company that's being bought out as a subdivision, then very often it will be held that no, this is a consolidation or a merger, and therefore you do not escape liability. And if the sale is fraudulent, if the buying company knows they're doing this, if they're doing it at a very low price because they know the company being bought out has massive liabilities or debts, and they're trying to use this as a way to get out of those liabilities and debts, then the courts will, again, say that this is a consolidation or a merger. It was not a clean asset purchase, and the purchasing company will be held liable for the debts and tort liabilities of the company being bought out. Now, there are such things as corporate takeovers, and every now and then some of these get so exciting you even hear about them on the regular evening news. A corporate takeover is without a merger or consolidation. One company makes an attempt to become the majority shareholder in a second company and thereby control the second company. Both companies would continue to exist, but the company purchasing the shares would now be able to run both companies, would have the power to change the board of the company whose shares were being purchased, have the power to elect new officers, and basically to take advantage of whatever business deals and transactions were going on in the company they were purchasing. Very often, this type of situation will create a conflict of interest between the directors and officers of a company and its shareholders. A company is looking to acquire the assets and contracts and to control another smaller company. One of the things that they can do is they can make something called a tender offer. Tender in this situation means to hand over or to give. So they're making an offer to hand over something to the shareholders of the company that they're trying to control. So the company that wants to purchase the shares basically makes a proposal to all the shareholders, offering money, offering stocks in the purchasing corporation, or some combination of both, to try and induce the present shareholders to sell their shares in the target corporation to the new corporation and be happy to do so. If the companies involved are publicly traded, then the companies making a tender offer must go through the same Byzantine and complicated process as you would have to go through to list a company on the stock exchanges, and to be able to sell them to the public, to make a public offering. So these things do happen, not that often, and the company who's making the tender offer, in order to fulfill all the requirements of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the state regulatory agencies, will have spent usually millions of dollars getting ready to make the offer and to have this happen. Now, the board and the officers in these situations of the company that is being taken over usually are not happy, because normally a takeover by another company means that they will be out of jobs, that they will not be superfluous. Some other group of people are going to be the majority owners of the company, and they're going to want to put themselves or their own people in the places. So very often, as I said, a conflict of interest quickly arises between the shareholders who are looking at these offers going, this is a better deal than I'll ever get in the regular market for my shares. I also get to own shares in this new company. That sounds exciting. So the shareholders might be very much interested in going through with this, while the board of directors and the officers don't want it to happen. So there are things that the board and the officers can do to prevent a hostile takeover, but they have to be very careful that they do not severely compromise the interests of the shareholders, because again, if they do that, the shareholders have a right to sue them individually for acting in their own behalf and not on the behalf of the shareholders of the company being taken over. Some ways to prevent a hostile takeover are, number one, it's called selling the crown jewels. Usually a hostile takeover happens because the smaller company has some contract, some equipment, some trademark, some patent on a new drug, some existing relationship with another company, some asset that's incredibly valuable that the larger company wants to get their hands on, and they determine that the smaller company is not going to give up or sell this asset, so maybe by taking over the smaller company we can now get access to this. So one way to stop the hostile takeover is to divest themselves, to sell off whatever it is that the larger company is looking for, to put it on the open market, sell those assets, sell that contract, sell that patent, and then there's no financial incentive for the larger company to keep coming after them. Of course, they may also have given away something that's critical to their going forward and continuing business and making profits in the future. They can institute golden parachutes. Golden parachutes are very expensive termination and or retirement benefits that can be given to board members, officers, and key employees. And one of the things they can do by setting this up, by making it such that anyone who leaves office as an officer or leaves as a board member or even as a manager is going to get some incredible compensation package that can make it very expensive for the purchasing company to come in and try to remove or replace these individuals. Another type of thing that the company being bought out can attempt to do is called the Pac-Man routine. And this is where the target company turns around and begins a campaign to try and buy shares of the company who is trying to do the hostile takeover. So now you end up getting into a bidding war where both companies are trying to become the owners of more than 50% of the shares of each company. Can get very exciting for shareholders in those situations as the prices of their stock begin to go up as the two companies are competing to grab as many shares as they can. The shareholders of the smaller company that is in the process of being taken over can do something called green mail. They can send out certified letters to all of the shareholders saying that they are willing to pay a higher price for the corporate stock to the existing shareholders than the takeover corporation is willing to pay. This is called a buyback. Corporations can buy back their stocks usually, as long as it's not prohibited by their bylaws. And the interesting thing says that if a share of stock is issued and bought back, even though it's owned by the company, the board of directors gets to vote it. So in effect, they get to vote for themselves. They get to vote to maintain their control. One of the things that's been happening recently, as money has been so cheaply available at 1% and 2% from the Federal Reserve to big corporations, is that companies have been borrowing money to engage in buybacks of their shares. And every time a buyback is successfully conducted, the board of directors and the existing officers have increased their power, increased their control of the company. They can issue a poison pill. The board of directors of the target company can issue something called stock options. Options are contracts to purchase shares of stock at a set price at a later date. And so what they could do is they could issue options to the shareholders, allowing them to purchase shares in the future at very low prices. This will dilute the value of present shares, and it would also mean that the company trying to effectuate the takeover would have to at some point deal with these options, either buy them back or issue shares of stock to cover them. And then they can look for a white knight. They can look for another company, a sympathetic investor, a hedge fund, or somebody that would be willing to put money into them to allow them to fight off the hostile takeover and to remain independent. Again, the board's response to and the officer's response to a hostile taker has to be reasonable and responsible, because their first duty is to act as a quasi-fiduciary for the shareholders. A tender offer by the corporation seeking to take over may be very favorable to existing shareholders, and that immediately puts the board and the shareholders in a conflict of interest situation. So it really prevents the board and the existing officers from fighting too dramatically, too severely to stop the takeover from happening. And remember, the business judgment rule applies. If in fighting a hostile takeover, the current board and the current officers make decisions that are financially not reasonable, business practice-wise not sound, that would lower the value of the corporation, reduce the value of the shareholders' stock for no important business purpose, then they can be held personally liable for their activities. All right. Normally, corporations can exist forever. And today, whenever a corporation is chartered, unless the articles of incorporation state there is a termination date, the presumption is that the corporation is intended to go on forever and to never end. Now, that doesn't mean that corporations do go on forever. There are several ways in which they can be terminated and in which they can be ended. First is a voluntary dissolution. The shareholders or the members of a limited liability corporation decide they no longer wish to conduct business or to conduct it under this corporate structure. They don't want to have a corporate structure. They can file documentations with the Secretary of State and the corporation's home office to terminate its existence. All right? These are called articles of dissolution. Notice must be given to creditors so that creditors don't end up being left out in the cold. And in Rhode Island, the Division of Taxation has to approve, and they basically will never approve unless every penny of taxes due from the dissolving corporation have been paid to the state. When the company is dissolved, whatever assets are left would be divided among the shareholders according to the number of shares that a shareholder owns. All right. Dissolution can also be involuntary. If there is